Well, hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this urgent panel discussion. My name is Jake Milstein. Today, we're going to be talking about the Kaseya attack. We have a lot of people signed up for this. We just started to do this a couple days ago after somebody asked if we were going to do one of these urgent panel discussions. We started doing these last year after some of the big ransomware attacks where people said, hey, we want a place where we can talk to others about what's going on and get some expert advice. And so we started doing these urgent panel discussions, and they've really grown. Our first one, I think we had 20 folks in the audience. And then this one, we have, I think, 300 people signed up. 250, 300 people signed up. So anyway, thank you for joining us. As people come into the room here, a couple of quick things. Number one, so my name's Jake Milstein. I'm the CMO of Critical Insight, and I host the events. You can always email me if you have something that's outside of this. It's just jake@criticalinsight.com. Second is who we are. So Critical Insight is a company that provides managed detection and response, which means we have a security operations center that operates 24/7, 365, and watches for signs of an attack and helps you get the bad guys out. We also have a professional services side, which Fred, who's on here, runs. And so we do all sorts of things, including incident response. And we'll talk more about that here as we go. The point of this is not a sales thing. We're just going to talk about the attack today, but I want to tell you who we are. So Mike Hamilton is the Critical Insight co-founder, former CISO of Seattle. Fred Langston, Critical Insight co-founder. He runs professional services. John Luke Peck is incident response expert, and Aletha Denis is one of our consultants and a social engineering expert. Stay to the end of this whole thing because we do have a survey at the end, and you can either get a gift card for filling out that survey, or one of the things we started in the pandemic is you can donate your gift card to a food bank, which is pretty cool. So stick around to the end. We really appreciate it. As always, there's a chat on the right. I'll be in the chat, Aletha will be in the chat, and I will take your questions from the chat and pose them to the group. And so put in your questions, put in your comments, and we'll make sure we get to them as well. We're going to start here with Mike Hamilton going through some slides, and then we have a special guest who I don't have up here, Mike Melanson, who actually responded to an organization that was attacked through Kaseya last week, and so we'll talk to him about that experience, and then we'll get to the panel. Mr. Hamilton, take it away.
Okie dokie. So thanks everybody for joining, and a lot of this is still changing quickly, but we all thought it was a good idea to get all the information that's known out right now, try to put a little context around it, and maybe try and explain things with a little more perspective than, oh, this bad thing happened. So you see the headlines here, they're everywhere. That second one there, ransomware attack on Kaseya, software firm threatens businesses. That's not what it was. So that is some sloppy reporting is what that is. It was not ransomware attack against Kaseya. I'll get into some details about exactly what went down here. But this had to do with the Kaseya VSA agent. And I believe that stands for Virtual System Administration. Yeah, I think that's what it is. And so this is all about this VSA agent, which turns out to be the most important part of all of this. So how did this happen? So Kaseya is a company that creates tools, one of which is a remote management tool, and it's used by a lot of managed IT service providers known as MSPs, managed service providers. And this chain of exploit here, the way this went down was the servers at Kaseya were compromised by this gang, and we know this to be the Rebel ransomware gang. And they used their access to those servers to push out a piece of malware, making it look like it's an update to the VSA agent, okay? And what they did was they, in a very sophisticated way, then executed a zero-day exploit against the server OS, and because the VSA agent runs as admin, it had all of this access. There was a PowerShell command that it used to disable the endpoint agent, Windows Defender, and then brought down a signed binary. That signed binary was an actual Microsoft executable that was very old and known to be vulnerable, and then it hijacked that, and that's what gave it enough of the access to the operating system to be able to start the encryption process. And interestingly, the encryption process wrote over the original sectors on the disk, which means recovery from disk would not be possible. I think that's a fairly common technique, but I was surprised to see that. And then the extortion demand came up. So this was a fairly sophisticated chain of exploits, which is over and above what the result of this has been. So it leads to a lot of questions. I will point out this is not the first time this has happened with managed service providers. Because they have a lot of customers, they are a trusted networking service provider for a lot of their customers. That trust has been exploited before. So this was back in 2019, and there was either 19, 20, I think, cities in Texas that all at once got hit with ransomware. And it's because the common MSP that had been servicing all of them was compromised, and that was pushed out. So these managed service providers are trying to get caught up with security. A lot of them do a really good job. We know a lot of them. We work with a lot of them, and some of them are very good. There's no way, though, that this could have been stopped. It was signed binaries. It came from a trusted source. It looked like a standard update. It used the Microsoft update service. It would have been really hard to detect this. Especially after they turned off Defender so that they wouldn't see the next exploit happening against that piece of Microsoft software that they downloaded. Okay, so who done it? Okay, so this is the Rebel ransomware gang. It's interesting that this was very clearly a smash and grab rather than their normal tactics of obtaining persistence, looking for the key areas in the organization where the networking infrastructure could be disrupted so that the entire business is flattened. And it doesn't look like that's what happened here. Also, Rebel is this ransomware as a service gang, and so there's an affiliate somewhere. Well, is that affiliate a buyer? Is that somebody who orchestrated this? Who is that? And they seem to be hiding behind this a little bit. The attack does seem to have avoided critical infrastructure, which is important because the rhetoric that the United States is using about ransomware operators has changed. And now we're using the terrorism word. And so this has caused a lot of consternation. And I've read reporting that says all of the ransomware operators that use these dark websites are now very carefully controlling their language. They're being very evasive about what they're doing because they know they are under a magnifying glass right now. So again, the reporting suggests that there's not been that much damage done, which is consistent, and Mike Melanson will talk about this in a minute, which is consistent with what we have seen doing incident response. We don't know what the relationship is to the Russian government of this Rebel ransomware gang. That is going to be a very key part of the investigation because the president of the United States just warned Mr. Putin that this kind of stuff wasn't going to be tolerated anymore. And again, we've changed our rhetoric, and we're talking about terrorism now, which opens up a whole new toolbox for us to use. In order to use that toolbox, we would have to prove not only that this gang operates out of Russia, this is known, but the Russian government had foreknowledge of this or was in some way involved. That's going to be a difficult part of the investigation. And other reporting has suggested that we're being tested. Russians don't care about words, they care about actions. So, in the fewest number of words possible, that's what we know now. Now let's talk about it.
And I want to get, as I said, right to Mike Melanson, who's joining us, especially for this one. Mike, we don't name organizations that we work with, especially for incident response. So we're not going to name the organization. But you did, you got the call last week, right before the holiday. You tell us a bit about the response, what happened, and what you had to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So we did get a notification from the client. One of the first things that we do when we get that type of notification is we alert our SOC because they have the tools to kind of look into the network and see the kind of traffic that's happening while we actually do some engagement with with our client or the other party at that time. So as we're looking at, we're getting on a call with our client, the SOC is diving into the telemetry. And the interesting thing, as Mike alluded to, is there was nothing to see other than, typical network traffic. We don't see C2 communications and that type of thing. But what we do see, from the call with the client is, yes, indeed, here's a ransom note. And yes, indeed, here's a bunch of files that are being encrypted with just a nonsensical file extension. So what our first course of action was just to see, well, what is being encrypted, what type of systems are being hit by this, and at that point, it was the boxes that had the Kaseya agent on it, and after several hours of diving with this client, it did seem to be confined to those particular clients. They were isolated from the network on the advice of Kaseya. They were the Kaseya VSA server was shut down so that there couldn't be any additional spread throughout the network. So I think what the takeaway is the client was fortunate because they only had the agent on a certain number of computers performing a very certain action, which was a result of that a service being provided by a third party. They actually didn't use Kaseya internally on their own things, but what's interesting is that when you hire a third party, you're not entirely sure what that third party is bringing in. They could be bringing in anything, and in this case, the client didn't even know that Kaseya was being used to manage those boxes. So I think that's the interesting takeaway from that.
So the 30,000-foot view of that is that the damage did not propagate past the servers on which the VSA agent was installed. It was limited only to those.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, right. Which is why the damage was limited, because the customer that we were working with, the servers on which the agent was installed were fairly immaterial to running that business, and so it's like, okay, we'll just we'll go from backup, rebuild them, do whatever we got to do, right? If it was your domain controller, being managed by a third party, then you're in a lot of trouble. So yeah. I think that was the damage limiting factor in all of this.
And it's interesting that all hell was breaking loose at that time. Excuse my language, but that's what was happening. Is we're looking at a ransomware that we think is isolated to a particular client. Then the announcement from Kaseya comes out. Then we get notifications that there are other clients that we have that are running Kaseya. So it was a scramble to get that word out, to get people to shut down their VSA servers, to isolate our clients that are using Kaseya product from damage. So
yeah,
and so Mike, I appreciate you telling the story there. There are a bunch of questions that are coming up in the chat. I'm going to get there, but I want to hit this question of was this a big deal? Was it not a big deal? Because for this organization, it wasn't a big deal. Fred, for other organizations, it was a bigger deal.
Yeah, we got a whole handful of calls that came in right at the same time Mike was dealing with our MDR clients. These were our professional services clients. And one in particular called, and we don't know what their Kaseya implementation looked like, but we do know their entire server farm was taken and ransomware. Worse, their backup server was not air-gapped and was connected as a server on the same network, and they got their backups as well. This client is literally breaking out CDs of, Windows Server and trying to go and look at paper records and figure out what data they actually lost. It is existential threat to certain clients. So I keep hearing this, well, we don't see much damage from this, or the damage is limited. And I can tell you that it's existential for some of the clients we've talked to.
And I want to get to Greg's question here in the chat. He says, can we talk about ransomware with Crypt versus ransomware with exfil and encrypt? There was nothing exfilled here, right, Mike?
Nope. So Melanson, you didn't see anything. There was no exfil, right?
That's one thing that the our security operations center, first thing they start looking for is stuff being exfiltrated actively from that network right now, and if so, what is it, so we can shut it down. And we didn't see anything. Another thing that we didn't see is logs. There was a lack of logs. That's one of the first things that we ask our client to send us is IIS logs or whatever it is. Empty. Nothing there.
Wow.
I think this is. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Fred.
I think that is the fascinating thing about this attack, because REvil in particular has honed their methodology to exfiltrate data, over a week, maybe a little bit longer before they actually executed a ransomware attack. What happened here was a completely different methodology where they launched automated attacks that went against, they say, I think 60 Kaseya clients that ultimately flowed down to 1,500 potential people who had these MSPs, 60 MSPs that then had 1,500 clients that were affected. This is very different, right? The exfiltration appeared to be not part of the model here, which is a big change, and why some people are thinking maybe it wasn't REvil, that maybe it's somebody different. But the whole approach was to hit as hard and as fast as possible with as many people at the same time, and then hope, I think, that the ransomwares came flowing in quickly.
Yeah, I mean, a really strange one. We've spent so much time talking about all of the different ways they make money. It doesn't look like they're making a ton of money on this one, right, Mike?
It doesn't look like they're making a ton of money. And frankly, I think they're running scared a bit right now. I mean, and this is a great point, right? This is clearly not the same tactics that have been used by this group. No exfiltration of data, no persistence gained in the network. It's smash and grab, which makes me think, so back in 2008, 9, 10, around in there were a lot of denial of service attacks against banks. What they found later was that was a diversionary tactic, and they were stealing stuff from the bank while everybody was trying to put out the denial of service fire. I mean, this smacks of diversion to me too, or just straight up testing by the Russian government to see if we're actually going to react here, right? Again, they don't care about words; they care about actions.
Well, we're gonna get to the politics, and we're going to get to the Biden administration response in a bit. I do want to back up, and Aletha, why target Kaseya? Why go after that tool?
I think that many of these ransomware organizations, we actually discount their ability to do reconnaissance and the amount of data that's out there about our organizations and just readily available on the internet, not to mention easily searchable. There are lead generation tools out there that will allow salespeople to make a few clicks and get whole lists of companies that use specific technologies and specific tools or agents. And if a ransomware organization can identify the greatest number of clients using a specific technology, then it makes sense for them. Their rate of return on investment will make sense to develop and exploit and identify vulnerabilities in that specific service, technology, agent, or MSP tool in this case.
And so taking that to maybe a logical conclusion. Maybe this is all a show and they wanted to go after one organization that was using Kaseya, and the diversion is that what they went after all of them, and we just haven't heard about the one. Is that where this is going, Mike?
Actually, I'm thinking that there's some kind of hybrid thing going on between espionage and organized crime. If that suggestion is true, there's an actual victim somewhere that nobody is looking at. And we know that the RNC, just had an event, and there's conflicting information as to, hey, did they really get, hit or not? And I don't think we can trust anything that's in open source media right now about that. Just got to maybe find out later and maybe never find out. But that's an awful suspicious timing coincidence.
And when Mike says RNC, that's Republican National Committee.
Yeah.
For those of you who don't listen to all of Mike and the acronyms he uses all the time.
I wanted to point out that there's this report of $70 million ransom to get this back, which is a total red herring.
It's a non-starter, man.
If somebody pays $70 million, we'll release the decryption key for everyone. I mean, who's ever heard of that? And who's actually going to pay that? The U.S. government? That was a red herring.
The UN.
Saying, well, it looks like the impacts are really limited here. I don't think we really know that yet. A lot of these organizations, like the ones a couple we talked to, they're not answering their phones right now because they've been working 24 hours a day, probably for the next couple of weeks trying to recover. And you're not going to hear what happened to them because from what I can tell, you really can't pay the ransom and get a decryption, as Mike alluded to, the way this actually works. There may not be a decryptor for this. So there's a lot of unknowns on exactly what the impacts are going to be and what it takes to get out of this.
And so Greg asked a question here that I think is a good time to get to it. What if any assistance do you all believe government should give small, medium, large businesses to shore up their cyber posture? So there are two questions there. First is, what do you do? How do you protect against something like this? There's, it's a 0 day. As Mike Melanson said, some organizations don't even know that they are using Kaseya and get hit anyway. So, what can you do? And then second is, what assistance do you think government should be giving? Fred?
So I'll start with the what can you do thing. The first thing people need to know is what your service providers are running on your network. If you don't know what those third-party service providers who have administrative access or connections into your network, if you don't know what they're doing, what they're installing, and more importantly, how are they protecting you from what they're doing, right? These are all things that you should be asking your MSPs and service providers so you can understand what the threat is. Most people didn't even realize this threat existed. If they saw that CVE, that Kaseya had a 0 day vulnerability, half of them will go, oh, I don't have Kaseya on my network. Well, yeah, you do. And you just don't know that that's the fact. So that's the first thing. And what can the government do? And Mike probably would be better at this than I would to answer this because he deals with the government.
About this.
Yeah, but I mean, I would say the government needs to put together a coherent policy on how we're going to react to things that are potentially related to nation state activity. And while I get the attribution is difficult, it's always been difficult. In fact, attribution is the one thing that is probably never absolute. So at some point we have to fish or cut bait and say, well, it sure looks like Russia that you're supporting this in some way, if not even that your law enforcement agencies are doing nothing about REvil. And we know that they're over there. We know that they're quasi-connected to your government. You certainly know what's going on. You need to either step up your law enforcement actions, Putin, or we have to take action. But Mike, I know you've got a lot more to add to that.
And Mike, before you go on that, I would just want to thank Mike Melanson for joining us. Mike, I know you have some other work you need to get done, but he joined us so he could tell us.
So Mike's got important work to do.
So Mike,
He's
thanks for
putting out fires, man.
And then Mr. Hamilton, sir, what you were going to say there?
So what I was going to say is the federal government is stepping in here, but it's going to be part of it's going to be painful. So the president's executive order on, hey, let's get our act together with supply chain security. what they're going to do is they're going to use the purchasing power of the federal government and the fact that they contract everybody and say, okay, if you're going to sell to us, the federal government, you're going to have to supply the equivalent of a software bill of lading for software products, okay, for technology products as well, so that you can source all the components of this back to their origin, and so that all that can be managed, so that you don't end up with something unknown, you know, an open source SSL library in a product that you produce that you're not monitoring and you don't know that it needs to be patched, okay, for example. So there's that. And there's already pushback on that. The private sector is saying, you know, federal government, you're really not that big of a purchaser, and we're just not going to do business with you. So, you know, this may not achieve the outcome there that we want. But now remember, for the longest time, it's been, hey, we want you to secure your networks. We want you to share information. Here's the NIST cybersecurity framework. Here's some standards of practice. Some of you are regulated, right? If you're in the energy sector, for example, you're regulated. And here's where we are. So there's no reason to do the same thing over and over and expect that the outcome is going to be any different. So the public policy that's really going to help here, in my view, is a combination of the following things. So number one, and we're going to get to this insurance thing, I think, in a second. Insurance companies are just taking a beating like crazy right now. And already we know that they're almost tapped out. They are paying out 70% of what they're taking in for cyber insurance, which means they're breaking even right now. This event could break some of their backs. So as the federal government has started to use this rhetoric around terrorism when talking about ransomware as applied to critical infrastructure, that gives insurance companies an out. That means, hey, we don't have to pay out as terrorists, right? As an act of war. In order for that to happen properly, the federal government has to become a reinsurer. And there are a couple of programs. One's called Crypt, the Terrorism Reinsurance Program. The other one's called TRIA. I can't remember what it means. And they're deliberating now whether or not the federal government is going to become the reinsurer for these ransomware payments. And if they do that, and I believe that they will, they can combine that with an outright prohibition on paying ransom, right? So federal government is going to backstop all of the insurance so that the insurance companies don't fall over. Companies that are insured don't have to worry about, you know, the insurance companies going up. We don't have to do anything about that. And combine that with this prohibition on, you know, paying ransom and, you know, potentially, you know, some work around trying to de-anonymize cryptocurrency. And all of a sudden you have broken the business model of the ransomware operators. That's how the federal government is going to help. They're not going to, you know, this whole part about, you know, new regulatory requirements for supply chain security if the federal government's the buyer. Okay, good luck with that. That might work. But don't pay ransom. It's now illegal. And, you know, make the bad guys move on to softer targets. And I think that's the answer.
You know, so one of the comments that came up here earlier from Nick is, you know, the question on the $70 million ransom that, you know, not one, that there's no one organization that's going to pay that, right? So Nick says, you know, the only way I would see big money paying is if a single insurance provider had enough exposure across all the targets. What if that was the federal government? Then would that make this worth it?
So the federal government is policy to never pay ransom. So they already have that policy adopted. They don't pay ransom to get the government. Now, local governments, maybe some state governments or agencies, certainly we know they pay. Usually though, that's through an insurance plan. So I go back and point to, you know, none of us really like what China does in terms of their approach to regulating business, but their recent crackdown on crypto mining, it has more to what's behind that than what people think. And one of them is we need to stop this flow of untraceable money. So we are no longer targets for things like ransomware because, you know, they're not immune to this. In fact, I can't remember, but there was an enormous amount of countries that were involved in this, and including, I think it was Norway with Coop, Sweden. Coop being a grocery chain who is not operating right now because they were taken out. So I think a lot of this has to do with, again, Mike says, don't pay, make it illegal to pay. And the fact that we have untraceable money this will never go away as long as we have untraceable money. Okay, I think people have to stand up and realize, I don't care how much you're a proponent of cryptocurrency, it's a big problem in our current world to have something that's untraceable in that form.
Mm-hmm.
Got it. So I want to go back to the fact that this is your 0 day. Aletha has some other stuff to do. She's going to hop off the stage and be in chat. John Luke Peck's going to come back. He does a bunch of incident response for us. And question here is, you talk to organizations all the time who say, protect me from ransomware, stop this. What can I do? It's a 0 day. There's no protection. There's no one thing you can do. When you see something like this, how do you talk to customers who are like, help me mitigate my attack surface here. Help me mitigate my exposure.
Yeah. Look, let me check real quick. Are you hearing me okay?
We are, yeah.
Fantastic. Yep. I had some internet problems. Thank you. So this is one of those circumstances where the normal guidance doesn't necessarily work, because you can take all of the proactive protection measures you can, things like email filtering, internet filtering, endpoint scanning, detection and response. All of these things will go together to help stop a ransomware threat from coming in through the normal channels like email and malicious links and downloaded files. But to your point, this came in through the supply chain. This came in through a trusted software update process for an application which is used to manage entire IT fleets. So it's very hard to say, well, what you need right now is EDR, or what you need is better logging, because none of those things would have stopped this. And so we're entering into an era between SolarWinds and Kaseya now. We've entered into an era where we can't trust the supply chain nearly as blindly and as willingly as we have for, I don't know, the last 15, 20, possibly even 30 years or so. And that's going to break a lot of people's models. When we start talking about this as an actual risk that organizations need to be aware of, and we're going from pie in the sky threat modeling of, oops, scary cyber Russian hackers might come in and take over your supply chain update process. Like, this was one of those far out scenarios that you bring up during a tabletop exercise, and you've got to try and contain the laughter, because it's like, well, that could never happen. Well, here we are, twice in 6 months, and not with small software packages either. Yeah. This wasn't like, oops, Notepad++ had a malicious download, or the CCleaner tool from the malware cleanup tool, which had malicious code injected into it through the open source process. Those are very specific tools. Those are niche tools used by arguably lots of people, but still, that's a tool you went out and got. This is a tool which is pushed out by IT teams. This is a tool pushed out by managed IT service providers who say, we need this in order to keep your network managed and up and running, which is going to make things very difficult when we're talking about how do you protect against that. And so the focus has to shift away from how do you stop the malicious binaries from coming in the door, because unless you're going to be sitting there doing full source code reviews of every patch, every update, and every program coming through your managed deployment process, this is not the kind of stuff which is going to be caught very regularly. You got to make sure that you're at a point where you can respond and recover rapidly. And I'll tell you, the organizations that I see able to respond the fastest and recover the fastest are the ones who have got effective logging, who have got good endpoint controls that they can light up at the flip of a button. So, if you say we've got 10 computers or 100 computers or 1,000 computers which have been affected, we need to contain them right away. And you can do that very quickly, combined with the ability to restore from a backup if and when things start to really go south. Those are the organizations that are able to recover from this inside of hours, maybe a couple of days or so. The organizations who don't have that, the organizations who are relying on traditional backup systems or who don't have full endpoint security management, those are the ones who we're getting the calls from saying, I just came into work and every one of my computers has got a black screen or a purple screen saying they want Bitcoin. And the challenge there is you don't have recovery options in those circumstances, especially when the backups have been attacked, which is becoming a very common practice for these attackers. When the backups are gone, there you're talking about just raising the environment and starting from scratch. This is no longer a recovery operation. This is, let's build you a new network and let's try and do it in a way that's going to prevent this from happening again.
Now, the use of a 0 day, I got to drill on this a little bit, because this is another tactic that is not commonly used by this gang, right? And 0 day exploits are generally not exclusively, but generally used in more espionage than in crime. And because it's a valuable thing, and once you use it, its value drops precipitously, right? Because now all the antivirus vendors know about it. They all have a signature. They're going to detect it every time, right? Cat's out of the bag. So, again, one of these things is not like the other, right? And this whole thing smacks of, this is really a lot different. I hope that it does not portend increasing use of 0 days by criminals, but it might.
I mean, here we are.
It's worth pointing out, though, that as Huntress Labs has been saying, this is not really a true 0 day. This a group called DIVD, which I believe is a Dutch organization, had actually identified this and notified Kaseya, I think, back in April. And so this, this is one of those things where that particular vulnerability in itself, nobody looked at it and said, oh, I can chain it in this way by dropping this phony or old Defender binary, which is vulnerable to side-loading attacks, which I can then combine these things and then get full access to the system. So I think there's a little bit of lack of imagination, as they say, in determining that this particular thing that was a 0 day back in April, that was very, not well known about, was very thought to be very limited, was able to be turned into something that is a broad working exploit. So I think the other thing that I think is interesting, there were some security technologies, though they haven't been reported which ones yet, that blocked this. Okay, so there are some security technologies reported to have been able to block this attack. I don't know which ones. These are just unconfirmed reports, but I can also tell you, we do have clients that had Kaseya, and we called them up and they said, no, we were not breached. We did not have an event. So there's a lot here, I think, that we don't know yet about what the blocking mechanisms may actually have been. There may have been some effective methods to block this.
Yeah, well, one of those effective methods may be carefully controlling remote access by your vendors like you're supposed to, right? Okay, yeah. Call us. We'll open up the hole for you. Come on in. And if you don't, then no.
So wait, so I want to go back to this Dutch company that identified this. So this happened, so they identified it in April. It's
Working
July.
On a patch.
It's July. What, I mean, is that too long? Did Kaseya take too long?
I don't think so. I mean, this stuff doesn't, it's not quick. I mean, you have to go through an actual development process, even if it's an emergency
regression testing, all of that.
Right. It's not instantaneous. And again, if the threat level was not recognized by, like I said, a lack of imagination, then you're not going to escalate this to something that's, something that you're going to move at, light speed to fix, and then at light speed to push out an update, and a light speed to tell every end user that this is not optional. You have to go out and patch this today. And you also have to consider that IT service providers, managed service providers, this is like, we have to stop everything we're doing at 60 of our clients or 100 of our clients just to patch this for the next 2 days. How do we keep those networks running during that time, right? So again, there's this whole flow of activity that seems, oh, why didn't it just happen? Well, it doesn't work that way.
Now, the other thing I think is worth noting is that the Dutch Institute reported 7 security bugs to Kaseya, and 4 of them were fixed in April and May. Now, according to the DIVD, the Dutch Institute for Vulnerability Disclosure, the Kaseya folks were very responsive. They were asking the right questions. They were very open to taking the research, and clearly, because they had patches rolling out up to a few months ago, they were working very quickly to try and get stuff taken care of. But there were these remaining ones that were due to be fixed. This is according to the register, due to be fixed in an upcoming release, and the attackers got there first.
Right. So how did that knowledge get away?
Right.
And maybe it was independent research, right? Because obviously finding a vulnerability that can be exploited after, as Aletha says, right, doing all the research, where am I going to maximize the ROI here, find the single point where I can get lots of victims, not only doing that research, finding out the agent that's being used, reverse compiling it, reverse engineering it, finding that there was a buffer overflow vulnerability somewhere, whatever, but then figuring out how to chain it with the rest of that stuff. Didn't necessarily have to get leaked from the company that was working on it, but that's a possibility too.
And I think that also points to maybe why they decided to do this mass attack with no exfiltration. They may have felt the clock was ticking, right? That they patched 4 of these vulnerabilities. The window's starting to close. All right, we have to go a mass approach. We don't have time to sit back and exfiltrate data and pick high value clients. We're going to bless everybody that possibly has this, and that's how we're going to do this. So again, there's all these things play together, right, to eventually end up where we're at.
And I will make another point about Kaseya. If you're checking out their own site, their blog on what's going on here, that is the most exemplary show I've ever seen of doing it the right way. You know, they are setting the example on how you communicate about what's going on, letting everybody know, here's when you can expect the patch. Here's when our SaaS operation is getting spun back up. It's like, here's what you need to do on your end. Here's a tool we produced for you so that you can search if you have, you know, a corrupt binary in here. And I have never seen anyone do a job that well at being able to communicate with the public about something that's gone this wrong.
So, you know, one of the hard things about the 0 days, and I want to get back to that question, is, you know, if I looked at the attendee list. We have a lot of IT directors, cybersecurity analysts, you know, folks in sort of this part of the world. But if you have a CEO, you have a CFO, you have a board that says, wait, you know, I thought that, you know, we would reduce our risk significantly if we did all these things, and now this 0 day means that we're vulnerable even if we do all these things. How do you talk to your executive board, your CFO, your CEO about something like this?
Well, you talk to them using business terms and talk about managing the risk of what is essentially a foreseeable event. Something will go wrong, you know, and you have to be prepared to, you know, the federal government uses this term resilience a lot, but you got to be prepared to take a punch and get back up. That's the secret to this. You know, Fred went through it a minute ago, the things that, you know, you need to prepare and you need to practice this thing. Our network's been crushed. What do? You know, and exercise your way through that, and you will find places where you need to make adjustments to make sure that you have maybe an offline domain controller, maybe, you know, backups that don't live in your building, and, you know, finding those little problems that you have that would impede your ability to get back on your feet quickly. You know, that's the way you talk to executives. You know, you protect the business. You don't promise you're going to keep the bad guys out.
Right. That's exactly it. Is your recovery plan needs to include that the executives understand that recovery is a key business process. It's going to happen. You're going to go through this. You know, there's no avoiding this rapid recovery. So for years now, we've been telling people 3, 2, 1 backup rule. Make sure you've got one that is completely disconnected and off-site. As Mike said too, have a copy of your domain controller unconnected to the network, running on a server that's just sitting there consuming power and keeping that current database alive and ready for reinitialization onto the network. If you don't have these particular resiliency components in place, you are going to be reporting bad news to the board and telling them, we don't really have a good plan to come back other than we're building up from scratch. So if you're not looking at recovery as a key core IT process, you're leaving out the key component to recovering from any of this stuff.
So
the challenge for IT.
I just got an email separately from one of the attendees that said, hey Jake, you guys sometimes do executive briefs when big things happen. And what we do is we produce a Word document that you can then get and edit and share with your board or share with your CEO. We'll do that for this one. I'll if you want it, shoot me an email, but I think what we'll do is just email it out to all attendees. I'll put my email address in the chat here. JLP, go ahead.
I think the key thing to highlight from what Fred was just commenting there is the recovery isn't just how quickly can you restore a file to somebody's desktop. IT departments across the board have on the whole got that down very, very well. Backups are performed regularly, the data is accessible, and so when somebody's hard drive's crashed, yeah, you can go and you can find the files that they were working on and you can make them available again. This is not that. These are not the kind of backups and recovery issues that we're talking about. We're talking about your entire environment has to be leveled. You need to start from scratch. do you have offline, offsite backups that the attackers were not able to get to that you can use to restore your domain controllers, your network configuration, your database servers, your critical app servers, your file data? All of these systems have to be prepped and accounted for in this recovery strategy. But you have to plan for essentially the nuclear bunker type of scenario where you have that data that's offline, isolated, and protected. Because like I said earlier, we are absolutely seeing the attackers go straight for online backup targets. And that includes cloud backup targets. So it's not just, well, I've got a cloud service, we're okay. No. You got to look at this as what's connected, where can you pivot to, what data is accessible. There are even ransomware variants, and I'm not sure whether it's automated or if it's being driven by the attacker, where they will go and log into the cloud services using stolen credentials and then delete the backups from the cloud services if they're able. They want to pen you into a corner here. And so IT teams today and company leadership who has to support this have to do everything that they can to make sure that they have that escape hatch, whatever you want to call it, that ability to recover from scratch if they come into work and the lights are out and the servers are all offline.
And it's also, I think this whole story has been about risk transference, insurance.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah,
not,
let's get into that.
That is not the golden ticket out of this problem. Okay. A lot of people go transfer the risk, which is a great, strategy for most business risk. And the executives, okay, we can't fix it, we'll just transfer it. Well, maybe, and maybe not. And within a year from now, we may not be able to transfer that risk. We know all sorts of insurance underwriters are not writing policies. They're not writing new policies in certain cases. They're raising premiums to a level where I'm still going to be paying $500,000 before they're going to even start kicking in money.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole risk transference model is, the wheels are coming off, basically, on what that means. So you got to be able to recover on your own.
Yeah, and they won't give policies anymore unless you can really substantiate your own controls, right? I mean, you've got to be able to show your security papers, go through their questionnaire, show your SOC 2 report, whatever it is. And anymore, that's table stakes for getting insurance.
Yeah, totally. And John Luke, I know you answered this in the chat, but I think it's worth saying out loud too for folks who aren't monitoring the chat. Shane asked a question, besides going back to tapes, what are our options for backups?
So without getting into specific product recommendations here, there are services and there are systems which will use essentially a Linux-based appliance on-premise as your disk-to-disk backup target. So your backups on-site happen very quickly and they're stored locally. And then it will synchronize that with a cloud service provider. That cloud service provider then requires MFA for everybody to access and also has essentially an undelete option where even if an attacker goes into your account and says, nuke all the backups, just get rid of it all they're going to do is put them off to the recycle bin for like 90 days. So you can always call them up and say, we just got attacked. The attackers got into our account and deleted our backups. Can you turn them back on for us? And then boom, your data is available again. The reason why I'm seeing that be successful is because one, it's Linux-based, so it's not subject to the same vulnerabilities that the Windows environment are. Two, it's oftentimes using different and completely separated credentials. So if the domain admin creds from the AD side get compromised, it's not able to work on the backup target. And three, with the cloud synced immutable backups, even if the on-prem appliance gets toasted, you've still got the data up and available on the cloud that you can restore from. It might just take you forever and a day because that's potentially a lot of data coming down. But those are the only organizations that I've seen able to essentially say, hey, ransomware, that's cool. And then they just dust it off, pick up, restore, and they keep rolling. They're back up and running inside of 48 hours.
And hey, Mike, Jonathan asked a question here. Or Fred, did you have something you wanted to say about the backups?
I was going to say, and the bad guys will know where your backups are. It is not a mystery. Their methodologies are, one of the first things they do is to start looking for network traffic that is indicative of backups. So they will identify where your backup system is first thing, so they can start looking into the ways they can either stop the backups from happening and wait a week so they know you're too far behind to recover, or just go out and nuke them, right?
And so Mike, Jonathan says, why were Kaseya SaaS servers not affected and only on-prem servers?
Don't know. Maybe because they were not necessary to carry out the attack and distribute the bad software to all of the MSPs.
And likely it's a different code base. I mean, what you're running in the cloud is not going to be the same code base necessarily that you're running. So if they attacked the code base for the agent-based stuff, the server-based stuff, I should say, that's probably coming from a different repo than what the cloud stuff is. Maybe even a totally dissimilar repo, right? One may be, running in the cloud for, and the other may be an on-prem, GitHub or, Git instance or something like that.
I think it's the same reason why the Hafnium attacks didn't affect Office 365. Yes, the methods and the services and everything are very similar. Yes, there's going to be a lot of shared code there, but I think Fred's exactly right there. The stuff running on the SaaS platforms is not identical to what's available for download. Travis notes in chat that the port wouldn't necessarily be open for the SaaS servers. And I think that may also be true. It just comes down to what was the CVE applicable against. And in this case, it sounds like it was just the on-prem stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right. So, Mike, earlier you talked about politics. We talked about how the U.S. responds to Russia. Let's dig into that a little bit more. What do you see as the Biden administration's options at this point? And what do you think is going to happen in the next couple of weeks here?
Okay, so let's preface this with, this is all conjecture, because they don't let me make public policy anymore for a reason. I think the options are to follow through with the conversation that President Biden had with President Putin not that long ago. And so this crap comes up again, we're going to smack you. So the first thing that's got to happen is a detailed examination into attribution, and then attempting to determine what the potential cooperation, collusion, foreknowledge was with the Russian government. And that is such a tall order. I don't think we will have a nation-to-nation retaliatory event. I don't, because we won't be able to prove that cooperation. Okay. So our options then are limited really to going after the individuals that were involved in this. And we've gotten a lot better at identifying actual, humans behind these things. And if that happens, we're going to do what we always do, which we're going to say, okay, you're now on the no-fly list. If you decide to take a holiday in Belgium, we're going to snatch you. And, that's given a lot of people a lot of pause. And right now, I think that's the tool we have available to us. If indeed there's an investigation and the intelligence community can say with a high degree of confidence the Russian government's fingerprints are on this, then we're going to smack them back. And what would that look like? We will probably never know. But it will probably be something that affects them financially and ramps up a little bit of pain on the population, because we want the population to go howl at Putin, right? We want domestic pressure to stop these things as well. So that's what it's looking like to me. That's what our options look like right now.
Well, we'll see if you're right. We'll see what happens here. And,
Mhm.
and some of the stuff we may know, some of the stuff we may not know, and some of the stuff we'll find out from a Bob Woodward book in a few years, right?
Yeah.
So a couple of things. A bunch of people have emailed me asking for that executive brief. We'll write it. We'll make sure we get it out to you all if it helps. The second is somebody else emailed and said, hey, I need to answer my bosses about our, where we are right now, and don't, we don't have time to do a whole risk assessment. I need something faster. Well, that just so happens, one of the things we do is a 13-point assessment. It takes about an hour. If you're interested in this, shoot me an email at jake@criticalinsight.com, or also we'll put a link to sign up for it in the survey. If you just want to know where your risks are right now, it's something Fred came up with a long time ago, and helps a lot of organizations just do a quick snapshot of where they are. It does not replace a full risk assessment, but if you need something real quick, we can do that for you. Also, I mentioned the survey, and that there would be a survey. There is, in fact, a survey, and the link to it is in the chat. We really appreciate you taking the survey. And by the way, we'll get final thoughts from everybody in a second. But we do appreciate you taking the survey. Links in the chat. It is you do have a chance to to get a gift card if you take it, or to donate that gift card to a food bank. But really, we do a lot of these, and we want your opinions. We take your opinions seriously, and we've kept doing this because people have said they're good, and people said, "Hey, include other people, include this," and so we've I think improved these because of that. And I'd be crazy if I didn't say, since I do run marketing, email us if you need anything. These are all of our email addresses. Mine is the easiest to remember because I run marketing, can pick my own email address. So it's jake@criticalinsight.com. All right, guys, while we have this up and people get our email addresses, final thoughts. John Luke, final thoughts.
Mute buttons need to be closer to hands. I think the stuff that we've been talking about here is it's going to come back down to the basics. Detection, the ability to respond, the ability to recover, but you have to look at it as not just, can I stop this binary? Can I stop this malware? It's, can I recover my organization from a catastrophic, business crippling technology outage? And that's different from, can you restore my missing Word doc? But my hope is that these kinds of events are prompting organizations, and especially technology leadership, to wake up and smell the coffee a little bit and recognize that we are not working in the world that we were working in 5 years ago.
Fred, final thoughts.
Yeah, I think you got to know what any service provider that has access into your network or is running systems on your behalf, you need to know exactly what they're doing. You need to know how they're doing it, what technologies and software they're using. And the oldest one in the book is, don't turn on network access to those external parties unless they're actually doing something. And the second they're done, turn it back off. Okay, that's been around. That's been a recommendation for 20 years. Well, it needs to become, with third-party, or excuse me, supply chain being the biggest issue right now, that's got to become standard practice.
Yeah.
Mike, final thoughts.
First, I'll agree with Fred. It's straight up. It's in the NIST cybersecurity framework. Remote access by third parties is managed. You do it or you don't. And if you don't, you're asking for it. My last thought is, this crap is going to continue until significant public policy helps us out here. Right? Yes, everybody go secure your networks and make backups, and this stuff is going to keep happening until the smackback really starts to happen, and or we break the business model of the criminals. That has to happen.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you. And thank you to everybody in the chat. Great questions today.
Yeah, great questions.
Great questions. Very, very helpful. And I love Christopher because he says terrific discussion. Thank you, Christopher. I really appreciate that. All right. So on behalf of Mike and Mike Melanson, who had to leave, and Aletha, who's in the chat, and John Luke Peck and Fred Langston, thank you, everybody. We'll do this again, hopefully not too soon, because it'll mean that something bad happened, right?
Hopefully don't have it, right?
Yes, but we live in reality here. So we'll do this again. We hope not too soon. Besides this, hope everybody had a good July 4th. Thanks, everybody, and have a good day.
Yep. Bye, everybody.